an hour of truth for the battered but proud people of the Empire State. From the financial and entertainment epicenter of New York City to the sleeping and empty small cities and towns of upstate, which once bustled with manufacturing, mining, and farming. We all know from inspiration, history, and nature, we deserve a return to the success and growth of generations past, a birthright being squandered by corruption in Albany, and the depredations of an insecure, scheming mountebank posing as governor, who loathes both us and himself. As liberty beckoned to enslaved peoples behind the Iron Curtain via American broadcasts after World War II, we now say, believe, rise, and join us. Welcome to Radio Free New York.
All right, welcome everyone to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host for today. Andrew Hollister is still out on vacation this week, and we decided to do a little pre-recorded show, but thanks everyone who is listening here on WYSL or on our other stations, WACK, WENY, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook on the Andrew C. Hollister page or the Radio Free New York page. Thanks everyone for tuning in, or of course our podcast if you're catching that later too. So today we have a guest. It's Kevin Fortune. He is the host of the Liberty Show and the King of Liberty. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, so thanks for being here. Kevin, just to tell us a little bit more about yourself. I brought you in today, and we're going to talk about John Lewis. We're going to talk about civil rights. We're going to talk about a bunch of different things. But Kevin, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Kevin Fortune. I am the host of the Liberty Show with Kevin Fortune on YouTube. Also, I've been known as the King of Liberty. I'm a very active person in the Liberty movement, getting things done. Just really promoting liberty to put it in action is my motto. And that has given me a lot of claim or fame or being infamous, whichever you like to choose. But that's what I do. Make things happen, really try to promote liberty, freedom around the world.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I know you've been around at state conventions for the Libertarian Party. You were active in the Republican Party for a while, or are you still active? I don't even know.
No, I'm active. I don't really, I'm not really into like partisanship type things, but I do speak a lot of conventions, do a lot of training. But whoever's willing to help put liberty in action, I'm willing to help them. And so I do get a lot of connections. That's also one thing that I have been noted for, is that I work across party lines. I'm sorry, and that has brought me some notoriety also. And I've been able to bring people together, both from the left, the right, the middle, and that's really, really important in any kind of movement.
Right, yeah, so you're doing activism that's more focused on like the policy outcomes and the ideology instead of just kind of the tribalism of partisan politics.
Correct.
Love that. And then, we're big fans of that here in Radio Free New York. We always try to make sure that our guests kind of understand the policies that are happening in New York State and nationwide, and how they're going to impact them. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So,
I'm sorry.
We'll dive a little bit into our topic today. The topic that I want to talk about was this article that I came across on Cato, and after seeing your show, and the lively discussion that it generated, I was like, you know what, Kevin Fortune would be a great guest to talk about this. And the article was John Lewis, Libertarian Hero. And it just got me thinking about like the different ways in which we think about libertarianism. And the first episode of your show, you kind of asked, what is liberty? And your guest discussed like the different ways in which they feel like they have liberty or don't have liberty in kind of a modern political context. So I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about like kind of the philosophy of your show, and then like what that first episode was, and then we can dive into the main topic here?
Sounds great. My show, of course, is the Liberty Show. It's nonpartisan, not connected to any group or anything like that. And it's a national platform call-in show for people to express themselves. But like, once again, I said, to actually promote liberty, but to put it into action. especially the four main pillars of liberty: free markets, individual rights and freedoms, limited, less government, and non-aggressive foreign policy. I'm a stickler for those main pillars of libertarianism, but once again, it's just about putting it into action. As you and I have stated so many times, we see a lot of people that talk it, but they don't want to walk it. People love to discuss, argue, debate, ideologies, but putting it into action. What has made our country the great nation, and the things that later on we're going to talk about, is people that put their libertarian liberty in action. This nation was started like that. All of the major movements, all of the major progress that we see that made America great was because of people of action, not just people of talking or rhetoric. And that's what we promote um, on our excuse me, on our podcast. But the one thing that makes us unique, we talk about subjects other people don't talk about, and I go beneath the surface. Another one of my claims to fame is I have been known to say pretty much anything, not in a disrespectful sense or to embarrass people, but I would talk about things and say things that sometimes are not the most politically correct or popular. But we really want to embrace our whole nation, and um, the individual citizen's point of view. A lot of times when you listen to television or radio, you get what the commentators say or what that station believes. But I like to hear directly from the citizens, and to try to help them to mold the true freedom and liberty and actually put it into action.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I love that. And with and I'm glad you're able to kind of start to build those ideas and build that consciousness there. And again, I want to talk about, like, the first episode, you talked about what liberty meant to a lot of people, and you had people from different backgrounds, different perspectives. You had someone who was gay, who'd grown up in a rural community. You had a African American guest who had talked about what liberty meant to them. And what are you seeing so far with some of these discussions you've had, both within your show and like kind of broader, in terms of like what's the state of do people feel like they have liberty and it has meaning today?
That is really a great question. And that's what I got excited about the first episode, because we use the word liberty or libertarian so often, but it means things to different people depending on where you're from, how you grew up, what kind of environment, whether you're urban or suburban, or rural, those type of things. And that's what's exciting, that you want to get different people's views. A lot of times we have what the government says liberty is, we have what a particular political party says liberty is, or what religion, or what the educational system, this their definition. But what does it mean to people? But also, in reality, we can say one thing on paper, but in reality, for example, you could say African Americans are free or segregation is over, but in reality, is that really the reality for everyone? So that's really exciting to me, not only to discuss, but to try to go forward, that we do see things, the real true liberty and freedoms. Um, some of the upcoming shows we're going to talk about, for example, are reparations to slavery, things like that. We're going to talk about like the religious freedoms, when it does it contradict sometimes with government or with like education system. My favorite one, the education system. Should we be paying for education? Things like that, because are they actually getting educated?
That's a
Things
great
like that, that
question.
a lot of times you don't see on TV, or people really want to talk about or go under the surface and talk about. Maybe even immigration. As a personal liberty, of course, we believe in open borders, but is it truly, is that the end of the story? Just having an open border, but do we actually have some problems with immigration or with some of the immigrants, even though we believe in open borders? So there's a lot of different perspectives to analyze, and a lot of things to work through. And that's what we want to do. We want to see some true and real liberty, not just talk, or have a smoke
Yeah,
screen.
for sure. No, that's fantastic, and that's a great start for our discussion. And we're about to head into a break. Again, we're here with Kevin Fortune today. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to Radio Free New York. We will be back in just a few minutes. All right, welcome back. You're listening to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson in today as your host, and we have Kevin Fortune, the King of Liberty, here on the show. So, Kevin, we were talking before the break. about your show and about like what liberty means to some folks, and you know, you I'm excited to hear some of your upcoming topics. Like the reparations topic, was already getting heated on your show, and I'm sure that's going to be really interesting when you do it. But you talked about like the concept of like if you're not able to exercise, your freedoms in any tangible way, does liberty have any actual meaning? So kind of to that end, what do we like? Do you think that we still live in a society where liberty is meaningful to folks?
Really great question. Yeah,
Yeah, I
actually,
mean, if you can't
from
use it,
my
right? Like, what good
experience,
is it if you have the freedom to do something, but
right.
you're not able to act upon it? That's a positive conception of liberty, and I think it's a question worth asking, right?
Yeah, it really is because that's what a lot of people are asking that question. That's why I kind of got stumped there because you would think that the answer would be obvious in America, this land of liberty and freedom, but it's really not. So many people that are still disenfranchised, not just people of color, but especially economically. One thing is that you can have a lot of freedoms, as we talked on our show. You can have the freedom to go to the movie theater now, but if you don't have the money to go there, or if you're gay and you're not treated the same once you get there, all of these things factor in to what people's concept of liberty is. And that is what we're facing in our country right now. And that's what we're promoting and trying to work through that so that everyone has liberty and freedom.
Yeah, for sure. And it gets interesting from a policy perspective, right? Because most of the time I'll hear that argument from progressives, because I tend to think of liberty in a negative way. Like no one owes you anything, right? Like I don't want to,
Right.
eh, make an obligation on someone else to be able to give me money or give me resources, whatever. Like I don't think I can put that on people. But at the same time, you acknowledge like, okay, does if I'm unable to go to the store with without facing discrimination, that's a real issue. And that's why I wanted to bring in on Monday for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but to talk about like, okay, like in the South, uh, you know back when, and also like you'll see some instances of this today. It's like African Americans in particular weren't able to go to the store. They weren't able to go use the bathroom, for goodness sakes, or go to a lunch counter. And how can you say that you have liberty in a situation where you're not able to access the basic goods and services around you? Even if you have the resources to do it, it's closed off to you.
Well, that is so true, Kevin. I think about that so often because one, like you said, back in the day, but even currently, there's still so many limitations on people's liberty, and that's why one reason we're promoting this podcast, and we're fighting for people's liberty and justice for all people, not just African American, even though because they have had so much discrimination comes across as that, but we're fighting for everyone. You would just be amazed at the stories that I get. I joke being the king of liberty, which let me say is not um, from a standpoint of like authority, because rulers and leaders are supposed to serve. I'm a servant of liberty. So I talk to a lot of people all across the country, across the world, actually, emails, podcasts, and interviews, and I hear these people's stories, and some of them are just amazing. But being a student of history, and I love Billie Holiday, it just reminds me of when she was singing in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, but yet she could not even drink from the water fountain, and she's singing there performing. She had to actually leave the whole building and go across the street. Things like, and that just stuck in my mind. But even today, there are people who go to particular schools, but because of their religious beliefs, they can't even eat what's on the menu, or they are segregated instances of people that are LGBT. They might be living in homeless shelters, places where they are exposed to not only discrimination, but sometimes abuse and disrespect and things like that. So a lot of it is still very, very real. And that's what we're working to fight. First of all, to expose it, to bring it to a national platform, and from the individual person's perspective, not just my summary or my analysis, but from the real person, for them to speak for themselves, and then to hopefully do something about it. Because we've had enough talk, we've had enough analysis, we've had enough just talking about the issues. possible solutions. But let's not only get a solution, let's start to implement something that's going to work for more change.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about solutions, what are you looking at?
Well, the solution is to me some real liberty. I think that it's really funny. I work part time at a civil rights cultural civil rights museum here in Atlanta, and is right now we have on display some documents from Dr. King. And one thing that just stood out to me was his view of the American dream, and he said, and I quote, "The American dream is a dream." And I just thought, oh wow, he's like, and when are we going to wake up from this dream? That for a lot of people, it's a dream. The American dream of owning property, of pulling yourself by your bootstraps. That sounds good for on paper, but in reality, it's not possible because there are a lot of roadblocks, there are a lot of hindrances, um, and a lot of it is with the government. So when you talk about solutions, number one, less government. The government regulation, the government controls, telling you what you can eat, whom you can marry, where you can go, and how to travel there. Just all of these regulations, things like that also like with the freedom of the free markets, where if we had more free markets, so many people wouldn't have to be on welfare, wouldn't have to be disenfranchised financially if they had the freedom to create their own business, create their own product. But there's so many hoops
Yeah, well, I think of like
and
the
that you
the
have
the
to go through.
licensing laws in some of these cases where you have
Oh
to go get a
yes.
license to do things like braid hair, walk dogs, or like
Oh yes.
shovel driveways or what. It varies from state to state in each municipality. But could you imagine if you're able to just like start working and you don't have to ask the government's permission to do that? It's it's like
Well, I have an interesting case of, for me, I also love to help people. I'm very an activist, and they had passed a law in Atlanta. Now they since kind of, you know, they didn't take it back, but they haven't been implemented. We had to get a license just to feed the homeless. If you wanted to go out and give
what?
bottled water to homeless, you had to get a license, and not only a license, a permit, and there's an expensive fee. It was like $350, and just
Was it like a food
unbelievable.
license or something? Like was that?
Yeah, they wanted just unbelievable. I'm like, just to
Yeah,
help people. But so much of the government regulations, so much these things would just really open a lot of freedoms for people, which is where we're gonna, go into that. A lot of the racism, a lot of the discrimination in America, all over, especially in the Deep South, but all over America, was implemented by the government, sanctioned by the government, enforced by the government, created by the government. So that's, the less government would make a really big difference in seeing people's freedoms and liberty.
yeah. I mean, you had de jure segregation and discrimination all across the board. And it's yeah, and in some ways it continues, but in more kind of ways that are presented as benign, like the professional licensing things. Like, oh, that's you can't feed the homeless because we're trying to protect the homeless from getting bad food. But yeah, at the end of the day, you're like, people just want to eat, or I want to be able to go get a job, but the government's saying no, no, we have to make sure for everyone's safety, we have to make sure that you're qualified for this job.
Right. And it seems like our government knows more about us than we do about ourselves. I was telling my podcast, I don't need the government to run my life or to mess up my life. I've done quite a great job of messing up my own life. I don't need the government's help, but they really think they know more about you than you do. And that can be a very dangerous thing. I mean, I believe there is a role for government. I believe in structure and order, but the excessive government and the overbearing, overburdensome licenses and just bureaucracy and red tape and regulations is really it's hurting people's individual rights and freedoms as well as the economics of our nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's structural barriers to liberty that still exist, and it happens at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. It's at all level. I do sometimes get into a thing with libertarians like, oh well, as long as it's happening at the local level, it's fine. Like it doesn't matter. A small government is okay as long as the federal government's not doing that. That's fine. I'm like, no, I agree. I want barriers at any level of government.
Correct, correct.
Yeah, I don't know if that's something that you've seen. I had an episode on states' rights last week where I talked about that a little bit. It's like, hey, just because a state's doing it, not the federal government, doesn't make it okay. States' rights are means to an end to enhance individual liberty, not the other way around.
I totally agree, and that's a really Ooh, a major it's a major issue for people who say they promote liberty or progress or freedom, because they look for their freedom and from the government, but yet a lot of times it's the government, even on a local level, that's doing the oppressing. So how can the oppressor be the one trying to free,
Yeah.
and like you said, it just happens even on the local level. A lot of the segregation laws, the marriage laws, things like that were on the local level, and it was just infringing upon people's freedoms. And it's really funny that actually in the deep south, a lot of the laws are still on the book.
Uh, really?
It and I remember several years ago, we're going to talk in a minute about John Lewis, and he was fighting in Georgia to get a lot of these Jim Crow laws off the books, but they were like, oh no, we're just keeping them on for historic
Historic
reasons.
reasons. No.
I'm like,
You
okay,
get them off
so
the books and
a
put them
black
in a
man
museum.
a black man cannot have a library card in Georgia and stuff
Oh
like
my
that.
gosh.
Like, come on now. It's really, yeah.
Yeah, wow, yikes. That's pretty bad. All right, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that and a little bit more about John Lewis too. We're coming up on a break. So thanks everyone again for listening here on Radio Free New York. We're here with Kevin Fortune. We'll be back in just a few moments to talk more about what liberty means and liberty in the civil rights struggle. All right, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host for today, and we are again talking to Kevin Fortune, the King of Liberty, here on Radio Free New York today. And we were talking before the break. We started talking about John Lewis a little bit, and again, the prompting for this show was an article I read on Cato, and I'll share this in the comment section of this of this video about John Lewis as a libertarian hero, and it was written by a guy named Michael Cannon, and he had kind of chronicled some of the ways in which John Lewis put his life and limb on the line to fight for individual liberty for African Americans and for all people in the South, and he approached this really violent system where he was beaten by government officials and private citizens for doing things like entering a whites only waiting room or uh, registering people to vote or again trying to desegregate. I think it was it buses was another one that he was involved with. I think he was involved with the Montgomery bus boycott, and so he had done quite a bit to fight for individual liberty. And I think a lot of people have trouble with kind of elevating him as a libertarian hero because they know John Lewis as a congressman today who is a Democrat and he's in favor of things like single payer health care. But I don't I think that we need to look at these what he's done in the past and admire the great work that he's done. Kevin, what do you think about this?
Oh boy, there's so much I
Yeah,
think about this. I'm crazy about John Lewis because number one, he's a person of liberty, but he's a person of action. And like I've been saying, he put his liberty into action, and those type of people just really excite me. But first, I just want to, mention the point that you're talking about, how liberty, how we exclude a lot of people, and that is a very dangerous thing in any movement. When you exclude people just because they don't 100% agree with you or think like you, that is very dangerous, and that's something that I haven't done. And one reason I've been very successful as the king, quote, the king of liberty, that there I actually have more non-libertarian type people, a lot of Republicans, a lot of progressives that work with me and support me, because we can reach over not just partisan lines but ideological lines. You can't just be a purist at all the time. We want everyone to be 100% like us, and we're running people out the room and running away a lot of very productive, fruitful resources and support. The one thing about John Lewis is, like you mentioned, some of the things, his boycotting, his protesting, but he was beaten, he was tortured, threatened, and just ran out of town, arrested numerous times,
yeah.
things like that. That's putting your liberty into action, and I really respect that. So many people, it's easy to just sit down and get on social media or write a letter or vent. But when you actually get out there and put your physical body, your finances, your mental state, your family, your life
Well,
in
you
danger, that
practice
just
civil
to me
disobedience.
is
You
one of
broke the
the
law to. to do this.
Yeah. Okay. So, I just think that he not only was John Lewis, he was just one example of so many people that have put their liberty on the line. When you were talking about the civil rights movement, I'm kind of like a civil rights historian. I love it, and it's just exciting because the movement actually started was the original kind of what we call the liberty movement in our country, even back from slavery, where you had the anti-slavery societies, which were the original. I call it. Libertarians because they were like nobody can own another person, and then even after slavery no one can regulate someone else's life, but they not only wanted freedom for the former the slaves, but they wanted for them to be self-sufficient, to be able to educate themselves, to work for themselves. But of course, as you've already mentioned earlier, a lot of the states and local governments put in what we call the Jim Crow laws and a lot of these barriers for freedoms. So people began to fight for those freedoms and for those barriers to come down, which was, in sense, a true a living example of the libertarian movement. And we see that they were very successful with it, because, but they had to actually fight. They had to get out and march and protest and go to jail. Unfortunately, some even had to lose their lives, like Dr. King and many others, in order to see some of the strides and freedoms that people have today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just think about like reading the history of the laws. Those is incredible. In an awful way. From blatantly taking away the Second Amendment rights of African Americans to prohibiting people from keeping jobs and prohibiting people from being able to work in productive fields, and often using violence to keep people in line too. That was just an inherent part of the system. The struggle it didn't really start with the civil rights movement. It goes all the way back to the beginning of our country too.
Correct. That's very true.
And so yeah, I mean in these types of situations, like how do you decide, like if you're someone who's our station listeners are probably more conservative and libertarian leaning. We do have a few Democrats who listen, I know, but if you're trying to build alliances with people, like how do you decide, like how much do you agree with someone before you build an alliance, and what's the main priority to take action for individual liberty? Like what do you see as like those kind of superseding principles that are worth building these cross ideological alliances?
Well, like first of all, like I said, you don't have to agree on everything. You can build an alliance without even agreeing. And anyone that's married or
Right.
has any kind of relationship knows that sometimes there's a give and take relationship there. And that's something that a lot of libertarians, even conservatives, we want it 100% our way, or it's our way or no way, or the highway. And that's very dangerous. And that's why we're not making as many strides sometimes. That's a really excellent point, because in the civil rights movement, that was also a big issue. They made a lot of concessions. There were a lot of times where they didn't stand up to white supremacy, or deal with things that people thought they should have been more radical or more violent. Even Dr. King got a lot of criticism for his total nonviolent stance of letting people spit on him or hit him or things like that. And others like, fight back or stand up, or you're an Uncle Tom, or you're weak, or something like that. But they used wisdom, and they weren't really compromising. They were just using wisdom to get the freedoms and to get the job done. And that's very important. But to go back to your question, some of the principles, the main pillars that I mentioned earlier, the limited government, things like that we can agree on, the individual rights and freedom. In liberty, that's what liberty means, is that it's your right to think what you think and my right to think what I think. We don't have to agree, but we can still work together to see progress. And I think that's what we miss, that part of liberty is that we don't have to agree, that you can be you and I can be me. And that's to me a beautiful thing. And it's the beauty of this nation and the beauty of the liberty movement, that you can still be yourself and I can still be me, and we don't have to agree on everything, but we can still get along. We don't have to disagree and hate each other and fight each other. And that's something that we're not seeing right now in a lot of the political climate.
I mean, it's a lot of it's just for at least kind of people who are liberty oriented. We think like as long as you're not hurting someone or taking their stuff, that's fine. We can agree to disagree on some stuff, and if we can kind of establish those first principles, then that's a good start. And Yeah,
Correct.
and I'll also give a shout out to our mutual friend Larry Sharp, who always says like he says the 80-20 rule. He says agree with me 80%, and that's how you know you could be on my team. 20%, you could disagree on some stuff, but as long as we can agree on most stuff, let's move ahead. Let's work together. Let's try to make some tangible accomplishments.
And that's very important, because it's really funny. A lot of my supporters, especially financial supporters, even before I started this, I had a pack and a group, Liberty America, we had a really good movement going. And the guy that helped me found it, he was a very, very conservative Republican. Even now, a lot of the people that call in are more very progressive. My friend calls them flaming liberals, and that so people, that's where they're like, Kevin, how are you doing this? Because I respect other people's ideologies, and but like you said, let's get the common grounds, not our differences. And like you said, the less government, limited government, but the individual rights and freedoms, even peace, the non-aggressive form. I deal with a lot of peace groups that I example, I have protested and marched with even some
Yeah.
communists. We were doing a lot of like
All right.
anti-war
Well,
stuff.
so
We
we're
don't agree
Kevin. I hate to cut you
economically. We
off, but
don't
we're
agree on
running
our.
up on a break here. So we'll keep talking a little bit
Okay.
more about that when we come back for our final segment. Again, thanks everyone for listening to Radio Free New York. We'll be back in just a few. All right, welcome back to Radio Free New York. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host for today, and again, I am speaking with Kevin Fortune, the King of Liberty, and the host of the Liberty show.
So
I almost said podcast, the Liberty show, but which is available on YouTube. And yeah, we'll make sure we plug that before the end of the show. But we were talking before the break, before I very rudely cut you off there for the commercial break. About the different alliances that you were forming. I wasn't cutting you off because you said you associated with communists there, but
oh no, that's fine. I was just commenting that we were talking about working together with alliances and how it's successful and how to get this to get more liberty and freedom in our country. And I was just saying you work with people where you have common ground, not your differences. And I was using an example like even the communists. Sometimes I've marched with them for anti-war things, for against for peace issues. A lot of times with the people that are on the left, extreme left, with cannabis legalization, with criminal justice reform. And now, of course, they don't agree with me on welfare cuts, or they don't agree with me on tax cuts or anything like that. But you take the common ground. I go to the right or the far right on free markets and less government or less regulation. And that's what you do. You work with people where they're at, and take the alliances that you can have, instead of sitting home fighting about what you disagree with. Find what you agree with and put that into action, and go move
yeah,
forward.
and that's the important part is that I know a lot of people like to consume politics kind of as a hobby, and I'm guilty of that sometimes too, and I want to not lull myself into a complacency, right? I don't want to just be the guy who's on the radio complaining about politics. I want to be making things happen. And again, forging those alliances where I see where a policy proposal can get advanced, and I want to find ways to make it happen. Sometimes that means working with conservatives, Republicans, things like that. Sometimes it means working with Democrats and liberals, and whatever way makes sense to kind of advance the policy proposals that I agree with. I encourage everyone who's listening to this show to get up and find different ways of doing that. I mean, Kevin, any suggestions in that regard? What kind of action should people be taking?
Well, right now, any action is
Any,
better than
all right.
nothing. Any action. It's funny because, like you said, you mentioned the word complacency. Oh my goodness, there's a spirit of complacency in all arenas, especially politically. And a lot of that, there are reasons for that. A lot of people have been just burnt out or just turned off, and that is very understandable. And that's one thing that I try to do is, and we mentioned our mutual friend Larry Sharp has just really been good at energizing people, motivating, bringing people back in. And I have I don't like the word following, but let's say partners in the Liberty, a lot of younger people that had just got out of politics, just, I don't even want to deal with any of these issues, but they're coming back in. But we have to allow people to come in where they fit in. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? And a lot of times we want to put them in a box. But starting, even with our podcast, speaking up is a start. Just venting on the radio on a podcast is not a bad thing. That's a really good starting place, because sometimes people will not even speak up at all. But once you speak up, you want to, as we say, put some feet to your talk, or put your money where your mouth is. Supporting people. I was just thinking today how the lack of financial resources, especially, or physical, people showing up to events. These are things that just really are vital. So maybe you're too busy, or you're not ready for a whole lot of hands-on, but you can really write a check. You can support a podcast like ours, or a radio show like yours, or an event, and that is very important. But it's also, there's nothing like being there, showing up to an event, showing up to a protest. Um, but just putting your liberty in action, that's one thing that I became noted for, that I put my liberty in action. I'm a libertarian. I say, hey, there's no free lunch. So a lot of times if people come, I don't let people speak for free or do stuff for free. And a lot of times, it just used to shock people, like, you mean you're going to pay me? You're going to do this? I'm like, hey, even if it's something minor, but put your liberty in action wherever. And what I'm saying is, no matter how small the beginning is, it can make a
Yeah,
difference.
absolutely. So that's great, and you know, I'm always thinking too. I want to encourage people to take action. I also want to encourage like to ways to like grow kind of the consciousness of like, again, all these government barriers to success. And again, that come from like professional licenses, or from regulations, or from restrictions on behavior in a lot of these places. And I always think like, okay, there's a lot of opportunity to build this movement. So how do we get more people involved, and not just I mean, libertarians frankly have a stereotype of being like, you know 25 to 40-year-old white guys mostly, to be honest. That's our reputation, fair or not.
Stereotype, or is that
Yeah, yeah.
reality?
So I no, I always say this, and I think I said this to you earlier before the show. Is like, I don't want to erase the activists in the movement who are, we have African American leaders, gay leaders, and women leaders, and people tend to erase those activists who are great and making huge strides in the movement. But we do have that stereotype, and not without there's some foundation to it.
Yeah. Well, I agree. Unfortunately, sometimes that is true, but there are many people like myself, like Larry Sharp, and like many others that are people of color, or from different backgrounds, that are out there fighting, and even people like you that may be of one color, but you're still fighting on for everyone. So that's really awesome. But to answer your question, the one thing, we have to think outside the box, but we also have to act outside of the box. We, not only libertarians, I see conservatives do it, liberals do it. They, or people, they stay within their box. They stay within their political party. They stay within their geographical, economic, or social circles. You got to think outside. That might not be comfortable. It might be scary, but you've got to venture out and launch out into the deep. As you do that, and think outside the box, you'll draw more people in. But if you want to bring people in and you want them to be in your little small box, that's not going to work. You have to meet people where they're at. And one thing that I teach with my leadership training, different things, my business, that it's 2020, but it's a new world. It's a whole new frontier. And what worked 20 years ago in the 50s is not going to work today. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand. What worked when the Libertarian Party started in the 70s, it's a different
Yeah.
world. And we have to change with that world, or not really change our philosophies, ideologies, but maybe just the practices, the protocols to get things done. And a lot of people get so stuck in a rut or in a box that they can't do that. So that's one thing, think outside the box, but also act outside the box. Try something different, try something new.
Do you have any specific recommendations there? Because I mean, I'm involved in that type of work. Any free advice you're willing to give out over the air?
Free?
I
There's no
know.
free lunch. You know me, no, no, no. Actually, but I don't like the concept of like diversity or racial quotas. But reach out to people that aren't like you. There are some brilliant African Americans out there. There's some brilliant Latinos. Women are way smarter than men. I hate to say it now. They're just creative, But also get young people. They're energetic. They have the energy to protest the march that I don't quite have sometimes. So, but reach out and get others, get a vast variety, get people from different backgrounds, from different ways of life. Reach out. In other words, we call it networking. But networking is not just giving business cards out to people or just showing up at an event. Networking is about relationships. Begin to develop strategic relationships, no matter how subtle, how soft. But reach out, to people in different organizations, so that when you go to do a movement, when you go to do fundraising, you have people in different networks set up, and that is very, very important.
Yeah.
That's my $1,500
Okay.
advice for the day.
So you can send the bill to Andrew Hollister. And
Well, that sounds so funny, but that's so simplistic. But you'd be surprised how many people don't do that. People call me, I can't sell this product, or my group is not growing, and I'm like, have you ever thought about just like fishing on the other side of the boat? Instead of the same spot you've been in for like 50 years and you haven't caught one fish.
yeah,
So just really reaching out to others is really
that's a
something.
good. No, I think that's fantastic. And I always see, like, occasionally, libertarians or other political activists will come out and they'll expect, like, they'll tell these ideas and they'll expect everyone to just latch on, but they haven't put in the groundwork to be able to build relationships with the type of people who may benefit from those ideas or can help enact those ideas. If you go out and you're just like, hey, look at me, this is my idea, and now everyone come on board my campaign or my political group, and they haven't built any of these other connections, it's not going to go anywhere, and that's how people get frustrated and burned out. But you didn't build the foundation.
Correct. That is so true. And to sum it all up, the one thing is just do something. Do something. Get off your behind and do something. I've just, so many people are just sit back and do talk and rant and rave or post or blog, and all of that is fine, and it can be the foundation of a relationship or of change or a movement. But you've got to go to the next level and the next step, and that's where a lot of people fail. A lot of people have a lot of brilliant business ideas, but they never actually implement them and put them into fruition, and so they don't see the results of the fruit. So just doing something, and that, if I can leave the listeners with anything, doing something. It doesn't have to be the greatest thing. Maybe you don't have a $1,000 check or $100, but even $10 to in support of something, or you even just passing out flyers or something like that. But
Do
do
something. All
something.
right, no, that's a great way to end. So we only have about a minute left. So Kevin, do you want to plug your show? Where can people find you?
You can find us, The Liberty Show with Kevin Fortune. It's on YouTube. You can like us on Facebook at The Liberty Show. Shows up as a podcast. And we're currently putting together our Instagram. We're also on Instagram. But if you need questions or comments, you can email me, Kevin at thelibertyshow.us.
All right, fantastic. Kevin, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for coming on Radio Free New York today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. Have a great day. And liberty to all.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us here on Radio Free New York.